Have you ever imagined that a child's promise of care could become a life sentence? The mother in our story believed that promise. After waking up from surgery, she smiled, content, as her son told her he was taking her somewhere quiet to recover. But that quiet place turned out to be a cold, abandoned cabin where she was locked inside and left to face her loneliest moments. Her boundless love was met with the cruelest form of abandonment. In the instant she faced that harsh reality, everything she had ever believed in came crashing down. Can a mother find the strength to rise from the ashes of such a betrayal? You're watching Deepu Cater Stories. Support us by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and leaving a comment to let us know which city you're watching from. The weight of the door. My name is Beatrice Holloway. Most folks just call me B. I am 68 years old. I used to think that if I could just raise my son right, see him stand on his own 2 feet, then I could leave this world with no regrets. But then came the day I realized some things. You can give, and never see a return. The final sound was not the slam of the door, but the soft, metallic rasp of the deadbolt sliding into place. A sound of finality. It was then I knew. I was no longer a mother being cared for. I was a problem being contained. I stood there in the middle of the dusty room, leaning heavily on the walker the hospital had given me. My new hip throbbed with a deep, methodical pain, a rhythm that counted out the seconds of my new reality. 1, 2, 3. I listened until the sound of my son's pickup truck, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, faded into the whisper of the North Carolina pines, and then nothing. The silence was so complete it felt like a weight, a physical thing pressing down on me, heavier than any lead blanket a dentist ever laid on my chest. Just that morning, my son, Theo, had been a different man. He had stood by my hospital bed, his face a mask of loving concern. He helped me into my coat, his touch so gentle. "You've spent your whole life taking care of others, Bea," he'd said. He always called me B when he wanted something. Not Mom. Never Mom. Now it's my turn to take care of you. I had believed him. You know, a mother's belief in her son is a stubborn, foolish thing. It's a weed that grows in the cracks of any pavement, no matter how many times it's been stomped on. He had described this place, this old family cabin on Hawk Mountain, as a sanctuary. You need fresh air, Mom, peace and quiet. It'll heal you. He spoke of recovery as if it were a town you could drive to, a destination on a map. I remember the drive up. The gravel road was rough, and each bump sent a spike of fire up my leg. I didn't complain. I just watched the back of his head, the tense set of his shoulders against the worn fabric of his shirt. I should have seen it then. The tension, the lie. But my eyes were clouded by morphine and motherhood. I saw only my son. My Theo, he carried my small bag inside. 1 bag, 3 changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, and a book I'd never get to read. He placed the few groceries on the rickety kitchen counter. 4 cans of pinto beans, a box of saltine crackers, a gallon jug of water. "The signal up here is a curse, Mom," he'd said, his hand hovering over my purse before gently taking my phone. "You don't need the distraction. Just rest." I'd nodded. Too tired to argue, too trusting to question. He looked me in the eye, and he didn't even flinch. They say the eyes are the window to the soul, but sometimes they're just well-polished glass reflecting what you want to see. I wanted to see my son. What I got was a stranger wearing his face. He who angers you controls you. In the crushing silence of that cabin, my anger was a wildfire, but I knew I could not let Theo control me. Not now. Not ever again. He didn't look at me as he left. Just a mumbled, "I'll be back soon," thrown over his shoulder as he pulled the heavy wooden door closed. And now, here I was, standing in the cabin my husband, Silas, had built with his own 2 hands. A place once filled with laughter and the smell of wood smoke. Now, it just smelled of dust and mice and abandonment. It smelled like a tomb. I shuffled to the window, my walker scraping against the gritty floorboards. Outside, the world was indifferent. The tall pines stood like silent judges. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridge, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple. A beautiful, cruel sunset. I looked at my reflection in the grimy glass. A woman, old and tired, her face pale from surgery. But in my eyes, something was starting to flicker. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was the cold, hard glint of a supervising nurse sizing up a critical situation. It was the look of a survivor, my inventory. One bad hip, a 4-day supply of heart medication, a handful of painkillers that wouldn't last the weekend, 4 cans of beans, 1 box of crackers, and the chilling, absolute truth. My son had left me here to be forgotten, to fade away. He had underestimated my appetite. For beans, for crackers, and for life. That was his first mistake. Ghosts in the floorboard. The first night was the hardest. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a cold, bruised twilight. The temperature in the cabin dropped with a vengeance. Each degree felt like a physical weight pressing down. My hip, my new hip, began to ache with a deep, insistent pulse. Pain is a patient enemy. It knows how to wait. I made my way to the bedroom. One room, a sagging mattress on an iron frame, a single wool blanket, thin and smelling of mothballs and thyme. I didn't have the strength to fight with the wood stove. Not yet. So I lay down, fully clothed, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The cold seeped up from the mattress, through my bones. It was a lonely cold. The kind that reminds you you're the only warm body in the room. Sleep didn't come. Instead, the ghost did. This cabin was Silas's sanctuary. Every object held a piece of him. The armchair in the corner, its floral pattern faded to a pale ghost of itself. The fabric worn thin where his head used to rest. I could almost see the indentation. He would sit there for hours, staring out at the trees, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. Towards the end, he did a lot of staring, a lot of sitting. On the mantelpiece, his collection of fishing lures, each one a tiny, colorful work of art. He'd taught Theo how to tie a fly right here, on that braided rug. Their heads bent together in concentration. A good memory. But like an old photograph, it had started to yellow around the edges. I remembered the arguments. 2. The hushed, angry whispers about money after Theo had gone to bed. My life as a nurse had taught me discipline. You assess the situation. You identify the problems. You create a plan of action. So, in the thin light of morning, that's what I did. Problem 1, my wound. I carefully peeled back the dressing. The incision was clean. No signs of infection. Good. I used a little of my precious bottled water and the antiseptic wipes from my bag to clean it. 1 problem managed. Problem 2, warmth. The wood stove was an old cast iron beast. I found a few logs, damp and heavy, by the hearth. The kindling box was empty. My eyes landed on the armchair. Silas's armchair. For a moment, I hesitated. It felt like a desecration. But survival is a practical business. It doesn't have much room for sentiment. I took my paring knife and carefully cut away a strip of the dry, brittle upholstery fabric from the back. It would have to do. Problem 3, the future. This was the hardest. My mind kept wanting to spiral. To think about Theo, to ask why, but I couldn't afford that. Not yet. Panic is a luxury for those who have a rescuer on the way. I had only myself. My walker scraped the floor as I moved about the small space, taking inventory. The floorboards were uneven. Near the hearth, one of them was loose. I remembered Silas always meaning to fix it. Curiosity, or maybe just the need for a distraction, made me kneel. The pain in my hip was sharp, but I ignored it. I wedged my fingers under the edge of the plank and lifted. It wasn't empty underneath. There was a small, flat metal box. A tobacco tin. Not for tobacco. though. Silas had quit years before I met him. I lifted it out. It was lighter than I expected. Inside, there was no money. Just a small, spiral-bound notebook and a folded piece of paper. The notebook was filled with Silas's cramped handwriting. Names, dates, numbers. I didn't understand it all, but I understood the words IOU and the desperate, underlined totals. Gambling debts. A sickness he'd sworn he'd left behind. The folded paper was a letter, addressed to Theo. It was unfinished. "I'm sorry, son," it began. "I've made a mess of things. A terrible mess. Be a better man than your father." The ink trailed off, as if his hand had been shaking too much to continue. I placed everything back in the box, slid the plank back into place. The ghost in the armchair now had a voice. A sad, broken one. I had been married to a man with a secret life, a secret shame, and I had never known. That second night, the cold was a living thing. It had teeth. My fire-starting attempt had failed. The damp wood just smoldered and smoked, filling the cabin with a bitter haze. I was shivering uncontrollably. My body ached. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about giving up. About just closing my eyes and letting the cold take me. It would be so easy. So quiet. Then, from my purse, which lay open on the floor, a picture had slipped out. It was a school photo of my granddaughter, Cora. Her smile was wide, missing a tooth on the side. Her eyes were bright with a light that hadn't learned about the world's darkness yet. That smile, it was a lit match in the cold darkness of my despair. I would not let that light go out. I would not let Theo's darkness be the end of her grandmother's story. With a grunt, I pushed myself up. I went back to the armchair. This time, I didn't just take a strip. I tore into it, ripping out handfuls of the dry, ancient stuffing inside. It felt like straw. Perfect tinder. I went back to the hearth, my hands shaking, not from cold, but from a new, fierce resolve. This fire would not fail. Later, after the flames were finally dancing, pushing back the shadows, I found a piece of charcoal in the cold ashes. I shuffled to the wall, the smoothest part I could find, and I made a mark. A single, straight line. Day 2. It wasn't a diary. It was a declaration. I was here. I was alive. And I was keeping count. The scent of defiance. Days began to bleed into one another, marked only by the charcoal lines on the wall. My world had shrunk to the 4 walls of that cabin. My body had found a rhythm born of necessity. Wake. Tend the fire. Clean my wound. Ration a quarter of a can of soup. Sit. Wait for the sun to go down. Repeat. But it was my mind that was in danger. An idle mind in a place like this, it starts to eat itself. I needed a task. A purpose beyond just breathing. On the 5th day, I rummaged through the back of a dusty cupboard. Behind a stack of chipped plates, I found it. A small little cloth sack of cornmeal, thankfully sealed. And next to it, a glass jar of honey, crystallized into a solid, amber block. It must have been there for years. I looked at the sack, at the jar, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than pain or anger or sorrow. I felt an idea. Making cornbread in that kitchen was a challenge. A dance with ghosts. The cast iron skillet was heavy, seasoned with the memory of 1,000 meals Silas had cooked. The water had to be hauled in a bucket from the rain barrel I'd set up. A slow, painful trip with my walker. I had no eggs, no milk, no butter. Just cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt from a forgotten shaker, and the solid block of honey, which I had to set near the fire to slowly melt into a thick, golden syrup, mixing the batter in a chipped ceramic bowl. My movements were slow, deliberate. It wasn't about the food. Not really. It was defiance. Each stir of the wooden spoon was a refusal to disappear. Each scrape of the batter into the hot skillet was a declaration that this kitchen was still alive. That I was still alive, as it baked over the low, smoky fire. A scent began to fill the cabin. A warm, sweet, earthy smell. It pushed back against the permanent odors of dust and damp decay. It was the smell of home. A memory of a life I thought was gone forever. The smoke, carrying that sweet scent, curled up from the chimney and disappeared into the vast, indifferent sky. A tiny signal from a forgotten place. What I didn't know, couldn't know, was that hundreds of miles away, another battle was being fought. A quiet one, in the heart of my granddaughter, Cora. My sweet, serious Cora, as I later learned, she had tried to call me. Every day. At first, my son, her father, had told her I was resting. Grandma needs her space. Honey. The doctor said no stress. But Cora is not a child who accepts easy answers. She knows me. She knows I would never go a day without speaking to her. The silence from my phone began to feel wrong to her. Heavy. She saw the strain on her father's face, the way her mother would stop talking whenever she entered a room. She was 16, but she had an old soul. She knew the shape of a lie, so she did what her generation does. She went online. In the quiet of her bedroom, with the door locked, she opened a private browsing window on her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't search for me. She was smarter than that. She went to the website for the Hawk County Sheriff's Office. There was a small, anonymous tip line. She hesitated for only a moment, her heart pounding. Then she wrote, possible trespassing at the old Holloway cabin on Hawk Mountain. Owner, Beatrice Holloway, is an elderly woman, supposedly traveling. Seeing signs of activity, might be vagrants. She read it over. It was smart. Impersonal. Nothing to link it back to her. She hit send before she could lose her nerve, and quickly closed the laptop. She had sent her own flicker of smoke out into the world. A desperate signal, hoping someone, somewhere, would see it. Back in the cabin, I slid the cornbread from the skillet. It wasn't perfect. It was dense and a little heavy, but it was warm. I broke off a piece. The sweetness of the honey was faint, a ghost on my tongue, but it was there. This little piece of cornbread, it wasn't much. But in that moment, it was everything. It was warmth. It was memory. It was proof that I was still here. I wonder, what's your cornbread when life has stripped you down to almost nothing? What's the one small thing you've done to remind yourself who you are? Share your story in the comments. I'm reading them. And it matters. The sheriff's gaze. It was the sound that came first, a low grumble, far off, like distant thunder. But the sky outside my window was a crisp, clear blue. The sound grew, winding its way up the mountain. It was the sound of an engine, steady and determined. The sound of tires crunching over gravel. My heart, which had settled into a slow, tired rhythm, began to beat a little faster. A frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I did not know what to hope for. Was it Theo returning with a flicker of conscience? Or was he coming back to, what? To finish the job? The thought was cold and sharp. A sliver of ice in my gut. I gripped the edge of the wooden table. My knuckles white. I was not ready. I would never be ready for that. The sound stopped. Right outside. Followed by the solid, definitive clunk of a car door shutting. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps. Heavy, even, and confident. Not the hurried, guilty steps of my son. These were the steps of someone who belonged wherever they stood. Then, a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps. Firm. Professional. Not a visitor. An official. I pushed myself up, my hips screaming in protest, and shuffled toward the door. Through a small, grimy pane of glass, I could see the outline of a woman in uniform. A brown shirt, a badge glinting in the afternoon sun. I saw the emblem of the county sheriff's department on the side of a large SUV. My breath came out in a long, shuddering sigh. It was not relief. Not yet. It was something else. The feeling of a game changing, the rules shifting. I pulled back the deadbolt my son had so carefully slid into place. The rasp of the metal was loud in the silence. I opened the door just enough to see her. She was a tall woman, maybe in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was all sharp angles, her eyes a pale, watchful gray. She wore no makeup. Her name tag read Rostova. I knew of her. Sheriff Eva Rostova. A woman with a reputation for not suffering fools. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with assessment. Her eyes scanned my face, my frail frame, the walker I was clutching, the dim, dusty cabin behind me. In that single, sweeping glance, I felt like she had read the last 3 weeks of my life. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt like a person, not a victim. "Ma'am," she said. Her voice was calm, with a slight, unplaceable accent. "I'm Sheriff Rostova. We received a tip about some unusual activity up here. Mind if I come in for a moment?" I opened the door wider and stepped back. She entered, her presence seeming to fill the small, sad room. She moved with an economy of motion, her gaze missing nothing. She saw the empty soup cans lined up on the counter, the ashes in the fireplace, the charcoal marks I'd made on the wall to count the days. Her eyes lingered on the single, half-eaten piece of cornbread on a plate. She turned back to me. The air was thick with things unsaid. This was a moment balanced on a knife's edge. I could tell her he was a good boy who just made a mistake. I could protect him. I could lie. The mother in me screamed to do just that. To swallow the truth, to smooth it over, to keep the family from shattering. But the woman who had spent 21 nights listening to the silence of the pines, that woman was tired of secrets. Sheriff Rostova broke the silence, her question simple, yet it held the weight of everything. "Beatrice," she said, her voice softer now. "Did you pack enough supplies for your retreat?" The word hung in the air between us. Retreat. A place of peace. Of rest. The lie was so absurd, so cruel. It was almost laughable. I looked at this stranger, this woman of the law, and I saw a flicker of understanding in those pale gray eyes. She was giving me an opening, a way to tell the truth without having to speak the ugly words myself. I took a slow breath. I met her gaze. "My son packed for me, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady, though everything inside me was trembling. He has always been one to underestimate my appetite. That was all. The corner of her mouth twitched. Just for a second. It wasn't a smile. It was an acknowledgement, an understanding that passed from one woman to another. She knew. She didn't need the details. She didn't need the tears. She had the truth. "I see," she said, nodding slowly. "Well, Beatrice, I think this retreat is over. Let's get you home." Home. The word sounded foreign. I didn't know where that was anymore. But as she gently placed a hand on my arm to guide me out of that dusty prison, I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't here. It would never be here again. A different kind of debt. The place they found for me was small. A one-bedroom apartment in a senior living complex on the edge of town. It was clean, sterile, almost. The walls were a pale, inoffensive beige, and the furniture looked like it had been chosen from a catalog for its durability, not its comfort. But after the cabin, it felt like a palace. The first thing I did was take a hot shower. I stood under the spray for a long time, letting the water wash away the grime, the smell of wood smoke, the feeling of abandonment. It's funny, the small things you take for granted. Hot water, a clean towel, a bed with sheets that don't smell of decay. That first night, I slept on that firm, unfamiliar mattress like a stone. I didn't dream. For that, I was grateful. The people from social services were kind. A young woman named Maria brought me clothes from a donation center and helped me file paperwork. She spoke to me in a gentle, careful voice, the kind you use for frightened animals or very old people. I suppose, in their eyes, I was both. I didn't have the heart to tell her I had spent 40 years as a nursing supervisor, managing crises far worse than my own. So I just nodded and signed where she told me to sign. My mail had been piling up at the post office. Maria brought it to me in a neat stack. Bills. Mostly. Junk mail. And one thick, official-looking envelope from the bank. My bank? The one that held the mortgage on the house I had shared with Silas for 30 years. The house I thought was almost paid off. I opened it with a sense of dread. The words were cold, formal. Notice of foreclosure? I read the sentence 3 times, but the words wouldn't change. It said the mortgage had been refinanced 6 months ago. A second mortgage had been taken out. The payments were delinquent. I sat there, holding the letter. My hands started to shake. A cold fury, sharp and clean, cut through the fog of my exhaustion. This was more than just leaving me in a cabin. This was a deeper betrayal. He had taken my home. The place where I had raised him. The place where his father's memory lived in every room. He had sold it out from under me. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Cora, my granddaughter. She stood in the hallway, looking small and scared. Her father, Theo, didn't know she was here. I could see it in her eyes. "Grandma," she whispered. Stepping inside, she didn't hug me. She just stood there, wringing her hands. Then, she held out a small, white envelope. My name was written on it in her neat, careful script. "What's this, baby?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She just pushed it into my hand and looked at the floor. "It's for you," she mumbled. "I've been saving it." I opened it. Inside was a wad of cash. $1 bills. $5 bills. A few 20s. Babysitting money. Birthday money. Her savings. There must have been over $100. An absolute fortune for a 16-year-old. Something inside me, something that had held firm through the cold and the hunger and the fear, finally broke. I didn't cry. It was a pain deeper than tears. I pulled her into my arms, and she felt so fragile. I was supposed to be the one protecting her. Instead, here she was, trying to fix a wound so vast she couldn't possibly comprehend its size. I held her tight, the smell of her shampoo filling my senses. She was the only clean thing left in this whole ugly mess. After she left, I sat at the small kitchen table for a long time. The bank notice lay on one side. Cora's envelope of hope lay on the other. And in front of me, I placed the small metal box I had taken from the cabin. The one thing I had insisted on bringing with me. I took out Silas's little notebook. I stared at the names, the scribbled debts. Then I looked at the bank letter again. The name of the second mortgage lender. It wasn't a normal bank. It was a financial services company. A loan shark, dressed up in a fancy name. I'd seen their type before. They prey on the desperate, and then I saw it. A name in Silas's notebook. From 20 years ago. A lender he owed a large sum to. It was a different name, but the same kind of operation. The same kind of poison. It wasn't just his face Theo inherited. It was his ghosts. My God. Silas didn't just die in that cabin. He's been haunting it ever since. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the box. I was no longer just a victim of my son's crime. I was standing at the edge of a family tragedy, a sickness that had been festering in the shadows for decades. I had thought my fight was for survival. I was wrong. My fight was for the truth, and it was just beginning. The coroner's report. The thought took root in my mind like a stubborn weed. It started after my first night in the small senior apartment the county had set up for me. I woke up not from the pain in my hip, but from a question that had been buried under 20 years of accepted truth. Why that cabin? Of all the places in the world, why would Theo choose the one place tied so deeply to his father? For days, the question followed me. It sat with me as I ate my toast in the morning. It walked with me as I shuffled down the hallway for my physical therapy. It lay beside me in the too quiet darkness of my new room. I was no longer just a victim of my son's cruelty. I was becoming an investigator. The target of my investigation was not a person, but a memory. My own. I knew that memories, like people, could lie. After 30 years as a nursing supervisor at County General, you learn a few things. You learn that the system runs on paperwork. Every life, every death, is a stack of paper in a file cabinet somewhere. I had a right to see my husband's record, as his next of kin, as his widow. All I needed was a reason. Martha Hayes still worked in medical records. We had started as candy stripers together, back when the hospital was just one small brick building. Her hair was gray now, her face a roadmap of good humor and long shifts. I called her, Bea Holloway, she said, her voice warm with surprise. I heard what happened. It's a terrible thing. Are you all right, honey? I kept my voice steady. I'm managing. Martha. Listen. I need a favor. I'm sorting through Silas's estate paperwork for the inheritance tax. It's a mess. I need a certified copy of his death certificate and the attending physician's report. Just for the lawyers. It was a small lie. A necessary one. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Martha was no fool. She knew the statute of limitations on inheritance tax was long past. But she also knew me. She knew I wasn't one for idle gossip, of course. B, she said, her voice softening. Come by tomorrow afternoon. I'll have it pulled for you. The records department was in the hospital basement, a place that smelled of aging paper and disinfectant. It hadn't changed in 30 years. Martha led me to a small, windowless room with a single table and 2 chairs. On the table was a manila folder. His name was typed neatly on the tab. Silas Holloway, you take all the time you need, she said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder before closing the door behind her. I sat there for a long moment, just looking at the folder. It felt heavy, heavier than a few sheets of paper should. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the string. My heart was a dull, heavy drum against my ribs. I didn't look at the first page, the standard death certificate. I knew what it said. Cardiac arrest. Massive myocardial infarction. A heart attack. That's what our family doctor, old Dr. Evans, had told me. He had held my hand, his eyes full of pity, and told me it was quick, painless. An act of God. I flipped past the physician's notes. His familiar, spidery handwriting filling the page with medical jargon I knew all too well. I was looking for something else. The last page. The one document I had never thought to ask for. The coroner's report. It was a standard form. All checkboxes and cold, typed out facts. I scanned the top section. Name Silas Holloway. Age 52. Location of death 114, Pine Ridge Road. The cabin. My eyes jumped down the page, past the toxicology reports, past the diagrams. I was searching for 2 lines. 2 simple lines that would either confirm the story I had lived with for 2 decades, or shatter it. I found them at the bottom of the page. Cause of death, manner of death. My breath caught in my throat. The words were printed in stark, black ink. Unflinching. Clinical. Cause of death. Asphyxiation due to hanging. The room seemed to tilt. The air grew thick, heavy. I read the line again. And again. The words didn't change. They just grew sharper, more brutal with each reading. The story of a quick, clean heart attack evaporated like a mist. In its place was an image so violent, so filled with despair, that I had to close my eyes. Silas. My Silas. Then I forced my eyes open and read the next line. Manner of death, suicide. Suicide. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. It echoed off the concrete walls. It struck me with a physical force. It wasn't an act of God. It was an act of desperation. An act of choice. I leaned back in the chair, the folder lying open on the table like a wound, and suddenly, it all made a terrible, sickening kind of sense. The closed-off look on Theo's face at the funeral, the way our friends would stop talking whenever I entered a room, the pity in Dr. Evans's eyes. They had all known. My son, my friends, my doctor, they had all conspired in a terrible, gentle lie to protect me, to spare me. And in doing so, they had left me to grieve a man who never existed, while the truth of my husband's despair was buried and left to fester. It was a betrayal sharper than being left in the cabin. That was an act of selfishness. This was a conspiracy of silence built on a foundation of pity. They didn't think I was strong enough to handle the truth. For 20 years, they had treated me like a child. I sat there, in the cold, sterile basement of the hospital where I had worked my entire adult life, and I did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It felt as though the floor had fallen away, and I was suspended in a cold, empty void. I had not been abandoned by my son a few weeks ago. I had been abandoned by everyone, 20 years ago, on the day my husband died, and I had never even known it. The unsent letter. I walked home from the county records office in a daze. The world seemed muffled, distant. The coroner's report felt like a physical object in my purse, heavy and cold. Asphyxiation due to hanging. Suicide. The words were clinical, impersonal. They didn't tell you about the silence that came after. The silence that had filled my house for 20 years. A silence I had mistaken for peace. Back in my small apartment, I made a cup of tea, my hands moving on autopilot. Assess. Identify. Plan. My old nursing mantra. But what do you do when the patient you need to diagnose is a ghost? What do you do when the wound is 2 decades old? My mind went back to the cabin, to the loose floorboard, to the small metal tobacco tin. I had brought it back with me, tucked away in my bag. I hadn't known why. Now I did. I retrieved the box and sat down at my small kitchen table. My hands trembled as I opened it. The little notebook filled with debts seemed less important now. It was just the symptom. The disease was in the folded piece of paper beside it. Silas's letter. The one he never finished. The one I had been too shocked to truly read the first time. The paper was brittle. The blue ink faded. The handwriting, his familiar, looping script, grew shaky and desperate toward the end. I forced myself to read it. Slowly. Each word a stone I had to turn over. Be my love. It began. My breath caught. He had called me that. Even at the end. If you're reading this, then the wolves have finally broken down the door. I've failed you. I've failed our boy. The shame of it. It's a heavier weight than a man can carry. I look at Theo. I see the good man he could be, and I know I'm a poison in his life. All I have to give him is my weakness. I had to stop. I closed my eyes, my fingers tracing the crease in the paper. I could feel Silas in this room. The scent of his sawdust and Old Spice cologne. The memory was so strong it was almost a haunting. I took a steadying breath and continued reading. Tell Theo. Tell him to be a better man than I was. Tell him the Holloway pride he gets from you is stronger than the Holloway weakness he gets from me. And, B. I'm so sorry. So sorry he has to be the one to find me. The last line, I'm sorry he has to be the one to find me. The air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. The room tilted. It wasn't just that Silas had taken his own life. It was that he had known our son, our 16-year-old boy, would be the one to walk through that door, to see him, to carry that image for the rest of his life, and suddenly, the past 20 years rearranged themselves in my mind. It was like watching pieces of a broken plate fly back together to form a terrible, complete picture. Theo, after his father's death, his silence, his grades dropping in school, the way he would flinch if I entered his room without knocking. I had thought it was grief, a teenager's moody sorrow. I had tried to talk to him, but he had built a wall around himself, a wall I couldn't seem to climb. I had given him space. I thought I was being a good mother. A patient mother. I had been a blind mother. I had mourned a husband. I had not known I was also mourning a son who had been lost that very same day. The anger I had felt toward Theo, that cold, hard knot of fury in my chest, it didn't just fade. It evaporated. It turned into something else entirely. An ache. A profound, bottomless ache. For the boy who had to cut his own father down. For the boy who had to call 911 while his world ended. For the boy who had to lie to his mother's face, year after year, to protect her from a truth he thought would break her. He carried that secret, alone. For me, and the cabin, The cabin on Hawk Mountain. It wasn't just a convenient, isolated place. It was a message. A desperate, twisted, terrible message. He didn't just lock me in a place. He locked me inside his memory. Inside his trauma. He had taken me back to the scene of the crime, the place where his own life had fractured, as if to say, "Here. You feel it now. You feel the silence. You feel the abandonment." This is what it was like for me. It wasn't an act of malice. It was a cry for help. The only way he knew how to show me his wound was to give me one of my own. I sat there at my kitchen table until the sun went down, the letter held tight in my hand. The tea in my cup grew cold. 20 years. For 20 years, my son carried the weight of that door, the image of his father, alone. We think we know the people we love, but sometimes, their deepest wounds are the ones they never show. If you are still listening, if you are still here with me, would you do me a kindness, please? Type the words "I am here" in the comments below, so I know I am not speaking into the void. To know that you are walking this path with me, your presence is the greatest strength I have to tell this final part of my story. The confrontation at the Hearth. The Saturday farmers market became my church. It was a place of quiet ritual. I'd arrive before dawn, the air still cool and smelling of damp earth. I'd set up my small folding table, lay out a checkered tablecloth, and arrange my offerings. Cornbread, mostly, but also buttermilk biscuits and small jars of apple butter. I called my little stand the Hearth. It felt right. A hearth is the heart of a home, a place of warmth you build for yourself. I wasn't getting rich. I wasn't even breaking even most weeks. But I was earning something more important than money. I was earning my days back. Each biscuit I sold was a small act of defiance, a declaration that I was still here. I had been running the stand for about 2 months when he finally showed up. I saw him from a distance, weaving through the crowd. He was thinner, much thinner. The expensive jacket he always wore was gone, replaced by a frayed sweatshirt. It looked lost. He looked like a ghost wearing my son's clothes. My heart didn't leap. It didn't pound. It just settled into a deep, heavy quiet. I had known this day would come. I had been preparing for it. He stopped in front of my table, avoiding my eyes. He stared at the handwritten sign, the Hearth. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. He looked tired. A kind of tired that sleep can't fix. "B," he started, his voice a dry rasp. I need to talk to you. I'm in trouble. Real trouble this time. I just need a little." I held up a hand, not in anger, just a quiet gesture to stop. "I know," I said. My voice was steady. It surprised even me. From the cash box beside me, I took out the folded, yellowed piece of paper, the letter I had found under the floorboards. Silas's letter. I unfolded it carefully, the creases soft as old linen, and placed it on the table between us. It lay there, next to a basket of warm biscuits. A lifetime of secrets on a 6x9-inch piece of paper. Theo's eyes flickered down to the familiar handwriting. He froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The bustling market around us, the laughter of children, the calls of the vendors, it all faded away into a muffled hum. The world narrowed to just this small table, this small piece of paper. I didn't say, "I know you left me to die." I didn't say, "I know you lied." I just looked at him, not at the desperate man standing before me, but at the 16-year-old boy I knew was trapped inside him. "I think it's time we talked about your father, Theo," I said, my voice soft, but clear. "About the secret you've been carrying for him." And for me, that was it. That was the key. The secret. It wasn't my abandonment that broke him. It was my knowing. My knowing of his pain. His face crumpled. It was like watching a dam break after holding back a flood for 20 years. The carefully constructed walls of anger and pride and desperation just dissolved. His shoulders began to shake. A sob ripped through him. A raw, guttural sound that came from a place deeper than his lungs. It came from his childhood. He didn't fall to his knees. He just stood there, his head bowed, and wept. He wept for his father. He wept for the boy he used to be. He wept for the man he had become. The tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the dusty ground. He didn't try to wipe them away. I didn't reach out to touch him. It wasn't time for that yet. Some wounds are too deep for a simple touch. I just stood there, on my side of the table, and let him grieve. I gave him the space and the silence to let it all out. The poison he had held inside for 2 decades, a customer, a kind woman who bought my biscuits every week, started to approach, then saw what was happening and quietly backed away. She gave me a small, understanding nod. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't a private shame anymore. It was just a human tragedy, playing out under the open sky. After a long time, the sobbing subsided into ragged breaths. He still wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the letter. At his father's words, "I found him," he whispered, his voice broken. I was the one who... I cut him down. I know, I said. And, in those 2 words, everything changed. I wasn't his victim anymore. And he was no longer my villain. We were just 2 survivors of the same shipwreck, finally washed up on the same shore. The First Loaf. After Theo's confession, a new kind of silence fell between us. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin. It was a fragile silence, an empty space waiting to be filled with something. I did not know what. He wiped his face on the sleeve of his worn-out jacket. His shoulders slumped not just with exhaustion, but with the weight of a secret finally laid down. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, waiting for a verdict, for condemnation, or maybe for a release he didn't feel he deserved. I took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of cinnamon and cooling bread from my stall. It was the scent of my new life. Not my old one. I will not give you money to fall with, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Your father fell. You fell. I will not be the one to push you off the ledge again. I saw a flicker of the old anger in his eyes, the resentment of a child being denied. But it died as quickly as it came. He had nothing left to fight with. But, I continued, holding his gaze, I will give you flour to rise with. The choice is yours. I pointed to the small, hand-painted sign leaning against the leg of my table. It read, in Cora's neat script, "Help wanted. I need someone to haul 50-pound sacks of flour from the delivery truck. I need someone to wash the mixing bowls and sweep the floor when the market closes. The pay is minimum wage. You start tomorrow. 6 a.m. sharp." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. I think he was expecting a sermon, or a hug. He got neither. I gave him a job description. It was all I had to offer. It was everything he needed. He just stood there for a long moment, the noise of the market swirling around him. Then, he gave a short, jerky nod, turned, and walked away without another word. I didn't know if he would show up. A part of me, the old, wounded part, almost hoped he wouldn't. It would be easier, cleaner. But the nurse in me, the supervisor, knew that healing is never easy, and it is never, ever clean. The next morning, as the first gray light of dawn spilled over the mountains, he was there. He was leaning against a lamppost at the edge of the market square, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like a man who had wrestled with his own ghosts all night and lost. I didn't say good morning. I didn't ask if he was okay. I just handed him a broom. The floor first. I said, corners to the center. And so it began. Those first few days were a lesson in awkward silence. We worked in the small space behind my stall, our bodies moving around each other carefully, as if we were 2 strangers forced to share a prison cell. The only sounds were the scrape of the broom, the clatter of bowls in the wash bin, the rustle of paper bags. He did what he was told. He swept. He washed. He lifted. He never complained. And he never, ever met my eyes. Cora became our bridge. She would come by after school, her bright, youthful energy cutting through the tension like a fresh breeze. She'd talk to me about her classes. She'd ask Theo a simple question about a delivery. She filled the silence with the normal, everyday chatter of a life that wasn't broken. She gave us a reason to speak in full sentences. Without her, I'm not sure we would have made it past the first week. Healing isn't a destination. It's the work you do every day. It's sweeping the floor. It's kneading the dough. It's learning to stand in the same room together without screaming. One afternoon, about a week in, I was preparing a batch of my sourdough. It was a finicky recipe, one that required patience and a good feel for the dough. I watched Theo as he finished scrubbing the last of the sheet pans. He stood there, his hands dripping, waiting for his next order. "Come here," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He hesitated, then walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "Watch me," I said. I showed him how to fold the dough, how to press and turn it, gently, coaxing the life into it. "You have to feel it," I explained. "It'll tell you when it's ready. It'll feel alive." I dusted his hands with flour. They were his father's hands. Strong, capable. But they trembled slightly. I pushed the soft, sticky mass of dough towards him. "Your turn," I said. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a kind of fear I didn't understand at first. The fear of failure, the fear of doing it wrong. I just nodded. A silent encouragement. He placed his hands on the dough. He was clumsy at first, pressing too hard. I didn't correct him. I just let him find his own way. Slowly, his movements became less hesitant, more rhythmic. He started to feel it. At one point, my hand brushed against his as I reached for more flour. It was the first time we had touched in, I couldn't remember how long. Neither of us pulled away. For a brief, fleeting moment, we were not a broken mother and a guilty son. We were just two people, side by side, our hands covered in the same white dust, working together to create something that could rise. It was not forgiveness. It was not a solution. It was just a start. A single, hopeful loaf of bread, proofing in a warm, quiet corner of the market, waiting for its time to go into the fire. The rising. It has been 3 years since Theo first picked up that broom. 3 winters of snow melting on the bakery's welcome mat. 3 summers of the screen door slapping shut behind children clutching cookies. The Hearth, our little market stall, is no longer a stall at all. It's a proper bakery now, a brick-and-mortar reality right on Main Street, tucked between Miller's Hardware and the town library. The bell above the door jingles all day long, a cheerful, constant music against the low hum of the cooling racks and the soft murmur of neighbors catching up over coffee. It is the sound of a place that is loved, the sound of a place that is deeply, irrevocably alive. I don't work behind the counter anymore. My hip, the very one that started this whole unlikely journey, has a memory of its own. It sometimes complains with a dull, insistent ache if I stand for too long. So, I have taken up a new, unofficial position. I sit at a small table in the corner, the one by the large front window that gets the morning sun. I have a cup of black coffee that is always kept warm for me. And from this vantage point, I am the quiet observer, the silent witness to the world we have built. I'm not the owner. Not really. I'm more like a landmark, a piece of the furniture that happens to breathe. From here, my little throne of wood and worn varnish, I can see everything. I see my granddaughter, Cora, standing at the register. She is a young woman now, enrolled at the community college, studying business management with a seriousness that both impresses and amuses me. She comes in on weekends, her face bright with the easy, uncomplicated confidence of youth. She handles the morning rush with a grace that I never possessed, knowing all the regulars by name. She remembers that Mrs. Gable likes her scones barely warm, and that Mr. Henderson always wants the end piece of the banana bread. She laughs with them, her voice clear and strong, a sound that cuts through the noise of the espresso machine. She is the warm welcome, the friendly face of our little bakery. I watch her, and I see a young woman unburdened. The past is not a weight on her shoulders, it is not a secret she must keep. It is simply the soil from which she has grown. Strong, and straight, and true, and in the back, through the large, open archway that looks into the kitchen, I can see my son. Theo is not the same man who left me on that mountain. That man, brittle with desperation and hollowed out by secrets, is gone. I do not know where he went. In his place is a baker. His shoulders, which were once hunched with the strain of lies, are now broad and perpetually dusted with a fine layer of flour, like a light frost. His hands, which once trembled with the frantic energy of a man losing his grip, are now steady and sure. I watch them as they work the dough, pushing, folding, turning with a rhythm that is both powerful and gentle. There is a quiet competence about him, a peace that he never had in all those years he spent chasing a phantom of success. He has found, I think, a different kind of wealth, the kind that comes from the heft of a well-risen loaf, from the satisfaction of a day's hard, honest work. He doesn't talk much. He never has. But now, his silence is different. It is not the silence of secrets kept, of words unspoken. It is the silence of focus, of contentment. It is the silence of a man who has found his purpose in the simple, ancient craft of making bread. He is not the owner either. That was a line I drew, firm and clear. From the very beginning, the bakery is in a trust, registered in Cora's name for when she is ready. Theo is an employee. He earns a salary, a fair one, just like our other bakers. He found a small, clean apartment above the old bookstore down the street. He is paying back his debts, one small, painfully earned check at a time. I know it will take him years, perhaps the rest of his life. But it is his debt, it is his mountain to climb, and he is climbing it, step by steady step. Sometimes, he catches my eye through the kitchen archway. He'll look up from a tray of glistening, golden brown loaves, his brow furrowed in concentration, and his gaze will find me at my table. I will look back at him. We don't smile. It is still too soon, or perhaps too late, for easy smiles between us. We just nod. A small, almost imperceptible dip of the head. It is a gesture that says everything. We don't need to speak aloud. I am here. I see the work you are doing. The work continues, and in his nod back, I see a response. I am here. I am trying. The work continues. It is enough. His wife, Claire, left a long time ago. She visited the bakery once, in the early days. She saw the smallness of it, the humility. She saw a man covered in flour instead of a man covered in success, and she could not understand. She could not handle the slow, unglamorous, day-by-day work of rebuilding. She wanted a quick fix, a magic solution to erase the failure. But healing doesn't work that way. It's not a miracle. It's a trade, a difficult one. You trade your pride for peace. You trade your secrets for strength. It was a trade she was unwilling to make. I have thought a lot, sitting here at this table, about love and forgiveness. They are not the grand, cinematic emotions I once read about in books. They are not a single, tearful moment of reconciliation. They are quieter, harder. They are small, everyday things. Forgiveness wasn't a word I said. It was the fresh bag of flour I bought and left on the counter for him to find. It was the clean apron I handed him without a single word of reproach. It was the quiet space I gave him to fail, to burn the first batch of scones, and to simply try again the next day. And I've learned a few things. Not from books or sermons, but from the searing heat of the oven and the patient weight of the dough. I learned that a parent's greatest gift isn't what they give, but what they teach their children to live without. We cannot shield them from the world's debts, from the inevitable stumbles and falls, but we can teach them the value of earning their own bread, the quiet dignity of their own two hands. Love, I discovered, is not a safety net meant to catch them forever. It is a recipe, and you must, eventually, let your children learn to bake it for themselves. My son, my Theo, learn that you cannot inherit forgiveness. It cannot be given to you like a house or a watch. It must be earned, day by day, in the thousand small acts of service and honesty that make up a life. He learned that the heaviest chains we carry are not forged by others. They are forged by the secrets we keep from those who love us most. He still carries the ghost of his father, Silas. I see it sometimes, in the sad, distant look in his eyes when he thinks no one is watching, but it is no longer a haunting. It is a quiet reminder, a silent, ever-present reason to be a better man. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: in a world that rushes, a world that values the appearance of success above all else, true healing is slow. It is patient. It smells like rising dough and freshly ground coffee. It is found not in grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but in the quiet, steady, often boring work of just showing up, day after day after day. We are all, in our own way, locked in cabins of grief and failure, the cold silence of our own mistakes, of betrayals we have suffered or caused. But I have come to believe that the door is not always locked from the outside. Sometimes, we are the ones holding the key all along. In our own trembling hands, we just need to find the courage, the simple, bone-deep courage, to turn it. And so, Beatrice Holloway's story, for now, comes to a close. What do you think of Bea's final choice, to offer a hand, but not a handout? Would you have done things differently if you were in her place? Take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly do read every single one. Your perspectives give these stories a life beyond the telling. If this story made you feel something, or made you think, please don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone you believe it might touch. And subscribe to Deepu Cater Stories so you never miss the human mysteries we explore together. I will see you in the next story. And who knows? Maybe next time, the story will be about you.